Bette Freedson, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's my pleasure, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you here. You were recommended highly by one of my other guests who urged me to have you on the show.
Oh, nice.
And then that was the beginning of a barrage of people somehow coming off of that interview and suggesting other people who are fabulous that I should interview. And so I guess that's always good, a riches of guests. We're going to be discussing intuition in psychotherapy, with particular attention to your book, which is titled Other Realms, Other Ways, A Clinician's Guide to the Magic of Intuition. And I know you've got a hard copy of the book. I don't. I read the PDF. Maybe you could hold your book up so people can see what it looks like.
How could you guess I would like to do that?
Yeah, that's great. You can see it very well.
Say that the artwork on both sides is by my grandchildren.
Oh, how neat.
I like to say that.
Yeah, I also have very talented grandchildren who are getting us through this COVID period, with their magnificent creativity that they have when they're young. And people probably couldn't see it on screen, but it's a clinician's guide to the magic of intuition. And magic is spelled Magick. In other words, that other spelling of magic that goes back. And in announcing this interview ahead of time, I announced that I was going to be doing an interview on the uses of intuition in psychotherapy, but I did not foreshadow that we would be talking about the paranormal. And certainly that spelling of magic kind of says that loud and clear.
Yes.
And so, one of the fascinating things about you is that you were a psychic before you became a licensed clinical social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally understand why you speak to that in the book, that you were looking for legitimacy, that you wanted to be taken seriously by the world.
Yes, and by the clinical community, particularly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Even though you weren't a therapist yet at that point, you still had that intention and ambition. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
To counsel. The counseling is always a part of my psychic work. I am not a typical psychic in the sense of I'm not telling fortunes, although hopefully people will feel fortunate to have a reading.
Yeah.
But, always with the sense of giving something useful that a person could use in life.
Yeah.
Part of my psychic work, even before my therapy work.
What drew you into the realm of becoming a practicing psychic? Did you have a sense early in life that you had particular intuitive powers or experiences?
I did early in my life. I felt I had a gift. I didn't use that word, though I think we all have the gift, whether we develop it as I did or in some other way.
Yeah.
But the moment came, particularly the impetus, when my then brother-in-law, his name was David Waltz, and David was a brilliant scientist and helped develop the science behind the internet. And David and my sister-in-law, Bonnie, took a course with a psychic, and it was then called the Silva Mind Control.
I've certainly heard of that, yeah.
Now, I think it's called the Silva Method. The woman who taught it, I mentioned her in the book, Ramona Garcia. I don't go into this much in the book, but she was an amazing psychic, no longer on the planet, unfortunately. But anyway, David proceeded on one dinner Saturday night to do a psychic reading in my living room. And I thought, this is unbelievable. I want what you've got. I think I've got it, but I want to develop it. And that led me to take the course with Ramona, other Silva courses, and then other people along the way helped me to encourage my natural ability to enter into that, what I call the psychic dimension of mind.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
was the beginning.
And had you had any experiences prior to that as a child that stand out? Often people do have experiences in childhood that they suppress because they pick up that the culture at large isn't going to honor that.
That's such a good question. I had experiences, and they were not so much in terms of recognizing something specific that would happen, but I had a deeper sense of my environment. And it's a little bit hard to explain because some of it did not have the words at the time. It was more a felt impression of something going on around me, almost as if I knew people, I knew about them, but I wouldn't have been able to say it in words at the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
when I was a young girl, 14, 15 years old, I can remember a moment when I knew I would have 2 daughters. It was just, I knew. And I knew from the time forever, they're children from my first marriage. I never picked a boy's name. And it was before we knew what gender the kids were. It was just, I'm having daughters.
Right.
That's probably the most specific I can get.
Yeah. Kind of a specific knowing. I should put on the table something that I haven't shared with you or dwelt on much in the show, is that I've had a long-standing interest in parapsychology and even taught an undergraduate course on it years ago. Went to psychic training workshops on a couple of occasions. Even got a strong interest in the tarot, and not so much from a fortune-telling point of view, but almost as a projective thing, like the Rorschach or something like that.
Yep.
And try to draw the person out, and it wasn't so much. Hopefully my intuition would come in in the process, but really just trying to draw them out and see what they see, and develop a conversation around that. I've also had a career in market research, and I did a presentation to a couple of market research groups suggesting that the tarot could be used in that way. And then a colleague developed, maybe not because of me, but she developed a deck herself of other kinds of pictures, but explicitly for bringing people out in focus group discussions. And I even ended up becoming a book reviewer in the early 70s for a magazine called Psychic Magazine.
Wish I'd known about it.
Yeah, and that later got changed to New Realities. And if you didn't hear the episode where somebody was interviewing me about the powerful run of synchronicities in my life by any chance?
I will listen.
I'll give you I'll tell you where you can find that, because that'll clue you into a lot about me.
Have some things in common.
Yeah, that's the thing that I wanted to get across. We really have things in common. And at the same time, I'm also a bit of a skeptic. And one of the people who influenced me, I don't know if you ever heard the name Larry LeShan, is a guy.
Heard the name.
Yeah, he was I think a psychic researcher who wrote a number of books. But the one piece that was one concept that he put out there that's really stuck with me, I think he referred to the repression of the sublime, which refers to the phenomenon that some of us, not all of us, but some of us may have transcendent experiences, but because we're not in an environment that particularly nurtures it and supports it in general, it kind of falls under repression. We don't,
Mm.
we lose the vividness and the conviction maybe that we had in that moment. And so me coming up through a very skeptical profession, clinical psychology, university training,
Mhm.
is particularly in the past, still, I think, can be very skeptical in terms of insisting on the scientific method as the only vehicle for true knowing. So that's always something I'm wrestling with. But I was impressed, particularly by the foreword in your book that was written by Dr. Scott D. Miller, who I think I interviewed years ago.
I bet you did. Yeah.
And I was very impressed by him. He does research on what works in psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And you cite a study that I'm going to have to actually go and read. I'm going to find it on the internet and read that paper, where he and a colleague, I guess, studied different schools of psychotherapy, but they included psychics and mentalists,
Mm-hmm.
which was pretty striking. I'm interested in what led him to do that. But
He's fascinating man. With variety of interests. Yes.
Well,
And
he was I was impressed. I heard him I invited him to be on my podcast early in the beginning of it because I attended a workshop that he conducted, and he was a really gifted presenter.
Barry. Yep.
And so he was talking about what works in psychotherapy, but this was before he had done the research that we're talking about here. And I'm talking way too much here. I want you to talk. But well, you tell us about what he found.
Well, I love listening to you too. There are more conversations for us, I'm sure. So I met Scott because, actually through Paul Leslie, whom you mentioned earlier, you also interviewed. And I had seen Scott's article that he wrote with his associate, Mark Hubble, talking about the research, and it's called How Psychotherapy Lost Its Magic. That's where the K comes from in the title, because it's referring to that sublime that you talked about, that we don't necessarily honor as therapists, as clinicians. So I knew Paul, and I asked Paul to introduce me to Scott. And he did. And once Scott and I got talking, there was a connection there that was important. And over the couple of years that we talked, he kept saying to me, come out, say you're a psychic. It's okay. And that we talked about this missing ingredient often when we are working clinically, as you, I think, aptly put it, about repressing something about, or suppressing something about, something that we know that we may be afraid to use. And Scott and I had many conversations about this and how important it is to bring this ingredient in. It's also important from the perspective of using the intuition in the framework of the client, that we don't impose it on the client, that we're using it, or as we say in Ericksonian work, we're utilizing the client's material in a framework that the client can understand. So this is largely one of the reasons I wrote the book. I mean, I wrote it because I want to put my work out in the world, obviously, but also to encourage therapists to use that MAGICK.
Right.
And, we both, you and I, have an interest in the paranormal. And unfortunately, a lot of times people hear magic as, I'm not going there.
Right.
No, I don't want to. But I've been there, and I'm still not over it completely.
Yeah, right.
Thanks to you, giving me an opportunity to talk about it. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
But the magic is using that psychic knowing along with the clinical. And that's powerful.
Yes. The thing that I wanted to pull out in the article that you referenced in the book is that he did a study where he looked at the results of a number of different approaches to psychotherapy,
Yes.
and he included mentalists
And
and psychics, and
yes.
and they actually did better, it seemed, than the more traditionally trained people. And that the thing that came out that makes total sense to me was the ability to get into the person's frame of reference,
Yes.
or having a common frame of reference. And I think the general public out there, the hoi polloi, if you will, are more open to psychic and unusual experiences that they've heard about. Even if they haven't experienced them, they don't come into it with a lot of skepticism in the way that more scientifically educated people might come into it.
Such a point you're making. Yep.
Yeah. So that's my sense of why it works as well as it does. And I should also mention another place of overlap between us. You mentioned Milton Erickson. I've been very influenced by his work over the years. Mm-hmm. And actually, my doctoral dissertation was on hypnosis.
Oh, wow.
Hypnosis and meditation. And that was in 1970. So that's that's a ways back.
And in a lot of ways, really at the cutting edge in those days.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's exciting. And I have to mention my mentor, Jeff Zeig, whom I think you may have interviewed too. I don't know. But
no, I haven't. I realize I should.
He's wonderful. And he's influenced me in so many ways in terms of my work and teaching me in various contexts, groups, and individually about Ericksonian work. And that I also do talk about in the book in terms of that using the client's frame of reference.
Right.
I want to cycle back to what you said about Scott's study in terms of finding that psychics and mentalists can get as good results, sometimes better than clinicians, because it is about frame of reference and it's also about attunement. In certain ways, when a person goes to a psychic or an energy healer or a reader of some sort, they go very open. Often they go to a therapist a little nervous, scared, more worried. Not all the time,
But but that's a good point. Interesting point.
I talk about that in the book. There's a section on Eliza, a person who went to an energy healer after having gone to many therapists and just felt that immediately that the energy healer understood her because of a look, a few words. And so Scott Miller's point is, what can therapists learn from psychics to help us engage? Because that study, I don't know if it's the same study or maybe a related study, that the key element in what works is really the relationship. The variable that's most related to success is relationship.
And we've known that for some time about psychology. There are psychotherapy. There are other studies that converge on that finding. So we know that that's really important. And also we know that, and we don't talk about this enough, but belief, the person's belief system, we talk about the placebo effect. And generally in the field of psychology and research, the placebo is put down as something negative. But in fact, it can be looked at from another angle as this tremendous capacity for inner healing and so on, that's built into us, that we come ready-made, and that, it's my point of view and not mine alone, that psychics and healers capitalize on that. So whereas we might, for research purposes, we want to rule that out,
yes,
to figure out that, that it's the drug that's working and not the placebo effect. But the placebo effect is part of a powerful human potential. And I think that people on the psychic side of things accept that and may have rituals and processes that actually tend one in that direction.
Yes.
Whereas the traditional, it's different than the white lab coat and the degrees hanging on the wall. Those also are a kind of ritual in the West to say, I am a healer. You should expect good things.
That's so interesting. I like the way you said that. And, if you think about, the plaque on the wall that says, I got my degree, it says to a person, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And so on some subliminal level, that can engender confidence, which can even be a variable in the healing process, which is what you're alluding to, and it makes so much sense. So the placebo effect is real. And, there's so many different ways that we could talk about that. I can think of various examples, but it's real, and it's not considered an intervening variable in the success of something scientific. It's considered, this is over here. It's a placebo. What you're saying is it's inclusive, and I completely agree with you. And then how can we, as therapists, use that other effect? Taking it way, way out here, it's paranormal. And there are some people who would really sort of look askance at that, like, oh, I'm not into that. But maybe it could be as simple as lighting a candle so that one could go gently into trance, which is a lovely way to enter trance and be available for the deeper work. So there are so many pieces to this, David, and there are so many ways to understand how that inner dimension comes into play in life, in relationships, and in the clinical situation. I'm hoping that in my book that I've given a beginning for people to begin to embrace what they have inside of them and what the clients have. So go ahead.
What I get out of your book in terms of who's the audience, who did you write this book for, is the sense that, well, it could be just about anybody who's interested in these topics, but it's more specifically to encourage psychotherapists of whatever stripe to invite them into this dimension.
Yes, onto both counts. I mean, it certainly could appeal to, the information can appeal to a larger audience, but it's directed towards a clinical audience. Someday, when the energy is there, I will revamp the information for a more general audience. But it's definitely geared towards clinicians to use this dimension. And in doing that, I'll just say briefly, I outline what I call the ACE schema.
Right.
Accept, acknowledge what you have, cultivate it, and explore using it. That's a simple way of putting the ACE model for developing one's own intuitive gifts. That could
well, ACE is an acronym, ACE. Tell us about each of those three.
So beginning to what you alluded to earlier about accepting as opposed to suppressing that other part of our knowing that's more sublime, that's more etheric, that some would consider psychic. It's like, and I go into a lot of detail in the book about how to think about accepting and how to recognize the little thoughts. Carl Whitaker, who's great therapist that many of the audience will know, referred to baby thoughts, that something would come in and he would go with it. We don't all do that, but learning how more and more to use those little wisps of something. For example, I was working with someone recently, something that was bothering this person. It's the content isn't important. And I intuitively thought to make a comment that's an everyday comment. Let yourself off. Could you let yourself off the hook? Might you? Would you let yourself off the hook? Person perked up. He said, "Oh, I was just thinking about something like that." And it occurred to me that probably this person fished. I said, "Oh, do you fish?" He said, "Yes." And I was just thinking
Wow.
about
Yeah.
how I can get caught up in something hook, line, and sinker. And it led to a whole conversation.
Great. Yes.
But thought was like a nothing thought, a little teeny thought, which was a
I,
big something.
I had not encountered, I haven't really studied Whitaker. So I had not encountered that idea of baby thoughts, but I really immediately connected to it. It's, I mean, in a way, it seems like it could be attached to the idea of free association, but it's a way of bringing it in, in a very natural way, and a way that anybody could relate to. You don't have to lie down on the couch or anything.
Exactly.
But to catch these, as you say, little wisps, they could be meaningful.
It is a free associative kind of experience. And the other piece, which is hypnotically relevant, is that one of the hypnotic features is the dissociative experience. And clinically, with our quote white coats and our clinical demeanor, we're supposed to track intellectually, clinically, track and track and track. What happens when the clinician has a dissociative moment where we kind of zone out a little and something else comes in? That can be the moment of what I call it the mini thoughts, or the mini hunch, or the wispy sensation. Happened, another example, talking to a person who wanted to leave a job but was only a year away from retirement, and the environment was really toxic and uncomfortable. And I'm listening, and all of a sudden I'm walking in the woods near my house. I'm having this dissociative moment, and I'm seeing, as if I'm there, I'm seeing the trail by the river and the trail higher up on the hill. And it comes to me again, it's like if I weren't a little bit more tuned in, I might have just, I got to get back to focus. I said, well, there can be beauty on the high road and beauty on the low road. And I'm thinking, does this have relevance? But I ventured it.
Yeah.
Turns out, of the whole treatment, she eventually terminated well and with a good outcome. And I debriefed her. She said, well, it was that moment that you said about the high road and the low road that really got me. It's like, okay.
Wow.
So I want to give examples rather than just talk conceptually.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are. And you do that in the book. There are several case examples that you give, and I'm going to call some out as we go along.
Good.
But feel free to throw them in as we go along. Maybe we should back up a moment and ask you to do something for our left brains here, so to speak. How do you define intuition? Since this is about intuition, how do you define intuition?
Oh, well, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm going to start with a story that threw me off track and then brought me back.
Okay.
I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and I'm not going to mention the name of the person I was talking to, but someone else in the field. And I was talking about intuition. And the person said to me, well, what's a good intuition and what's a bad intuition? It's like, took me aback. And I have to say, I did not have a great answer at the time because I had never thought of it that way. And then it was about 2 years ago. It was before the book was even fully written. And so here's what I say about intuition. It's not a good or a bad thing. It's not a thing. Intuition, as I think of it, is an embodied experience with mental, sensate, emotional, and more what we might call paranormal psychic experiences, impressions. And I go into detail about that in the book in terms of psychic language. Could be intuition, can be a sense of knowing, come to one in a sound, in a picture, like walking in the woods. And so it's another way of knowing in its simplest form. Eric Byrne, who everyone who knows him knows from the games people play, wrote a book, I think it's in the 40s.
I think it would have been more the 60s.
Maybe, I don't know, I'd have to look, but it's an older
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
And it's called Intuition and Ego States. And he terms this, the intuition, the archaeopsychic state. And he tells psychologists that if they want to be successful, they need to resurrect it. It's kind of what we're talking about. So what is it? It's defined by each person in their own way. It could be, I define it as what I know, what I don't know yet. Now, one distinction I want to make, David, for the audience is that in order to use intuition, it doesn't have to be something I don't know. It doesn't have to be, I can name your best friend. What it is, I think of it more like clinically, it's the unconscious. Psychically, it could be what psychics call the Akashic records, all the knowledge that's out there, and all I do is just tune in. So how you define it is not, I don't have the absolute right definition, but what I really believe is that it's based on minimal cues, what I pick up.
Uh-huh.
It's based on my experience. It's what I know. And it's based on these little hunches, these little sensations that come in all different ways. So I hope I'm not disappointing people by not giving them the final word on intuition.
Yeah. Right.
I encourage
Right.
people to explore it for themselves and find out what it means to them.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? There was one paragraph that I actually have quoted in my notes here that I thought was really important. And we were talking about Scott Miller's research, and we were talking about mutually constructed reality. And let me just read this quote, which I think you'll recognize since you wrote it. In the language of psychics, in the language of social work, in the language of Ericksonian hypnosis, we can use metaphors and projectives to help people bring forth motivation and wisdom to face the challenges and manifest their dreams. When we deliberately utilize intuition to guide our formulations, diagnoses, and interventions, we'll be in a state of readiness to infuse our work with artistry and soul. It's not over yet. In any language, we can help our clients analyze the resources of the psychic dimension and make good use of magic, spelled with a K. And so that really encapsulates much of what you were just talking about, I think.
Thank you for reading that. Metaphor goes hand in hand. One of my topics, I just did a presentation last week on metaphor, that the intuitive ideas often come in metaphor, like the hook that I mentioned earlier, or the high road and the low road. And the metaphor, using metaphor is kind of a pathway into that beauty of the intuitive dimension. And so when we're thinking, Scott Miller also talks about deliberate practice. So really studying our work behind the scenes, and that's his department. I'm not going to go into that. He's the one to talk to about that. But studying our work behind the scenes, our work in general, or a particular case, particular session, sometimes metaphors come and they can help us develop the ideas for the next session, or how to help the client formulate their own goals. So that, again, the point of what that statement is use it all. Use it all in the session, use it all behind the session, use it in life, because it makes the experience of living and working a fuller experience, a deeper dimension, more levels of realization of how to be, how to work, how to provide therapy for others. So thank you for reading that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing it. Maybe you can share with us. I think another part of the psychic experience, one that's interested me quite a bit, is synchronicity and things that happen in your life that somehow in the outer life that speak to inner needs, and so maybe you can share here the memorable event around your graduating from Boston College, but needing a job, being a mother with 2 small children, and you're in this position of what now?
Well, actually, because I have to give a shout out for my alma mater, BU School of Social Work. So,
okay.
But yes, that was a major one in my life. I had been, well, I guess I'll start it here. I was looking to graduation. I needed a job by September 1st. I was a single mother and I had to get employment. I had used my resources to go to school. So I was interviewing and the jobs weren't the right fit for one reason or another, and it was getting close. And so I sort of made an agreement with my inner self in the form of my spirit guides and said, okay, you guys, which is my agreement with me, whatever job is offered me by September 1st, I'm going to take it. As it turned out, the job that was offered to me was a job in an organization, and the details are in the book, but an organization of which I had already been on the board of directors. So I had been part of this organization. I had worked in this organization, and I thought I was done. It's like, I want to go. And it wasn't a clinical job, which is what I wanted, but it was going to start on September 1st. And so I trusted my intuition that I had decided that I would take a job on September 1st. This is in the category of projective intuition. That's a bigger discussion. It has to do with healing. I have other stories about healing, but I took the job reluctantly, but it turned out to be the best decision I could have made, because
it's also reminds me of what, metaphorically speaking, people talk about putting it out to the universe.
That's right.
So in other words, you set that intention, that desire, and then you said, I'm just going to enter into a state of trust that the universe will provide. And it did.
Well, absolutely. I wish I had said it like that, but thank you. Yeah, that was exactly. So I thought of it more like using my spirit guides, but it's the same idea as just what you said, is setting the intention. So I asked my spirit guides to send me the right job, and they did.
And I want to remark about the spirit guides, my take on the spirit guides, and I think this fits with you as well. There may or may not be spirit guides, but it is a metaphor that works for you.
Yes.
And so it's not something that we could put to any kind of a scientific test to see if there are or are not spirit guides. But at a practical experiential level, you've had experiences where that metaphor works for you, as in the story we just told.
Well said. And often, again, coming back to clinical work, if I'm sitting with someone and I'm thinking, I'm not sure where I want to go, sometimes briefly, I'll put out that intention. I like the way you said that, in the form of asking a couple of my spirit guides. And there are things in the book about my spirit. There's a couple of things about spirit guides in the book, and I'll put out the intention, and then whatever comes to me, I'll triage a little bit the thoughts that come, but there's usually something that will come that's useful, like go in this direction or try this. And so it is a setting of an intention. And I mean, there are so many stories about spirit guides that I could tell you, but ultimately you're right. It is a metaphor for.
Yeah, okay. It helped me to, there's something about the way that you put it that sort of helped my skeptical side.
Mhm.
It helped me to put it to the side. And I think it was in the context of you were actually talking about what a lot of people might think of as a seance, and calling forth the spirit and so on. But it can be framed as it doesn't matter whether an actual disembodied spirit
Right.
is there from the past of dear Aunt Wilma,
Right.
but rather it becomes a way of getting that energy, those memories, the feelings, etc., into the room.
Well said. Absolutely. There's one section in the book about one of my group sessions in which we sought metaphors or spirit guides as metaphors. And I call that section the spirit guides because it is the guidance of the inner knowing. Call it spirit, give it a name. Aunt Wilma.
Yeah.
One of my spirit guides is my uncle, who was a doctor, Uncle Abe. And there's something in the book about Uncle Abe.
Yeah.
It's really trust in oneself, confidence to proceed on, confidence that I'll have in me what I need. It's really about generating a stronger sense of self, it being relying on spirit, the inner spirit, formulated however you think of it. I mean, people formulate it in religious terms.
Right.
Believing in higher power of your understanding. But it's also, whether you believe that higher power is, a being or it's an energy, it again, coming back to what is really most important to the person.
Yes.
The person's language.
Yes.
Is so critical.
And you mentioned having the confidence in what comes.
Yeah.
And I think that's the C in ACE. We didn't get all the way through.
Oh, no,
A was acceptance. And C is confidence. What's the E?
Well, I have to say, I wish I had thought of it, but I didn't put confidence in there. But for listeners, David put it in. I'm going with it. Cultivation.
Okay.
But there are a lot of A's and a lot of C's.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there are many. You make up your own, but the cultivating the inner knowing by recognizing those impressions. And then E is experimenting, exploring, taking chances in life. Like I took a chance on September 1st, or in work, like talking about the hook. Explore it a little bit, or explore it in reading, or explore it by, listening to a show like this, or listening to other psychics, or however people explore. It's a dynamic process for becoming more in tune with one's own inner knowing.
Yeah. Well, one story that plays into what we've just been talking about is the case of Bert, who wished his parents had been alive to see his success in his career. Maybe you can share that story with us here.
Powerful story. And this story, in a lot of ways, is kind of representative of a lot of different stories in which people have some unresolved issues with parents. In Bert's case, Bert he had been born with some congenital problems. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the problems, but he survived in a way that was so powerful. He became a really wonderful nurse and very intellectual individual, but his parents never knew him as that highly successful person. And so we just took him into an intuitive space where he could have that affirmation from his parents. And it was so powerful for him, because talking about confidence, that experience, even though it happens on some etheric level, gets brought into the self here. And that gets into some brain science. And I'm not a brain scientist, but the brain experiences things. When we tell ourselves to taste a lemon, we start to get the feeling of tasting a lemon. The brain experiences, Bert's experience on the psychic level was almost as if he was talking with his parents on the real level.
Yeah.
That's a key.
And this reminds me of conversations I've had with neuroscientists and therapists that are bringing that understanding into their work.
Yes.
And that it's not enough to have an insight, but it's got to be experienced. Because the part of the brain that has insights is the part that's very verbal and lots of thoughts and so on, but is not where the trauma and the pain are. Those are in another part of the brain, and they're sort of distributed to different parts of the brain. And that's got to be tapped into for the healing to happen. So and Freud used the term abreaction, and I think he was way ahead of his time in that. We're just now coming around to restating it in neuroscientific terms, that it's really important to connect it to the feeling part of the brain. And so the story you're telling with Bert was that he had that experience. And I think you used almost what might have been described as a Gestalt therapy technique.
Yes, that's right. So I consider myself an eclectic experiential therapist, as I've learned from Jeff Zeig, whom I mentioned. So hypnosis is part of that, and Ericksonian techniques are also part of that. But the experience sometimes is very Gestalt. And what you're saying, which is absolutely correct from my experience and my belief, is that it's the limbic brain that when we tap into the experience, it goes into the limbic brain. We can use the thinking brain to integrate that, but the experience and that almost pre-verbal in a certain way, even though there are words incorporated, is where the power is. And that's also part of the power of the intuitive, that it can take the person to a level where the incorporation into self can be more enduring, more lasting, more powerful. And that's where clinically this work, I think, really has a place.
Yeah, that's the third part of your book, is titled Integrating the Magic with an Intuitive Approach.
Yes.
And for me, that brings up, I also have an interest right now tracking the use of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And a lot of attention is being paid there to integration. Again, that idea of the repression of the sublime, that you can have an experience, a powerful psychedelic experience, but you might need to work at bringing it into your life, at figuring out what's the transition, because I'm not going to live in this altered state all the time.
Right.
What does it mean? What are the implications, and how do I manifest it in my life? So I'm seeing a real connection between the psychic version of that and the psychedelic version of that.
That's interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. I don't know. I know that research is going on, but I don't know a lot about it. So that's interesting to me.
Listen to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Good idea.
Yeah, there's a lot about that in there.
I will.
Yeah, maybe we've got time for one more case. You mentioned your Uncle Abe, and you've got something you refer to as the case of Tom and Uncle Abe. Maybe you can take us through that.
Well, briefly, Tom was worried about some health issues and was really concerned about, and the details are in the book, but the idea is what matters. Worried about some tests, worried about the outcomes. And we did so Uncle Abe, Abraham Servetnik was my uncle. He was a wonderful doctor, died much too young. But Uncle Abe has come to me over the years as a spirit guide that I would use when I want to set the intention for healing. So Tom and I talked about setting an intention for Uncle Abe to help him heal, and have Uncle Abe put his hands on Tom. And if it did nothing else, it relaxed Tom so that his anxiety could dissipate. So even that would be sufficient. But we also worked on having healing taking place in him. And as it turned out, his tests were fine. So that's the short version. I've used Uncle Abe in a lot of different circumstances for healing. Who knows? I have a little skeptic side myself. Is Uncle Abe really doing the healing? Is it the intention? Like you said, David, we can't measure that right now.
Right.
We can't measure that right now. So if at some point we could measure how much that affected, I don't know. We maybe will, or we maybe won't. But again, to that, the placebo effect, we know that stress plays a part in dis-ease. So was it that Tom could relax and his body could heal and that was good? Was it Uncle Abe? Was it going to be that he was okay anyway? We'll never know for sure.
Yeah.
But the session was really powerful for him.
Yeah, the something we didn't mention, but going back to the job that you got after you got out of the social work program at Boston University, involved some group work, community work, and you ended up specializing quite a bit in stress reduction work.
Yes.
And you were able to bring a lot of what you talk about in terms of intuition and intuitive techniques into that work too, and you found it to be very effective.
Very effective. The first groups, I'm also group work certified. I love running groups. The first groups were stress management through psychic development. And I almost always have an intuitive aspect to my groups. But the stress management using the intuitive part of the mind is so powerful because of setting intentions, placebo effect, relaxing the sympathetic nervous system, trusting that one has some way of being in charge of oneself. A lot of times people feel so out of control when there's something really difficult going on in their lives. And so that can also, the intuitive work can provide a sense that, okay, there's something I can do to take care of myself, even when outer circumstances may be largely out of my control. So there are many ways that the intuitive piece comes into play. And I don't call the group psychic development, but maybe I will again to refer back to my own work. But I almost always have a meditative piece, an intuitive piece in my group work, and also in my teaching. I remember hearing Herb Benson speak many years ago, and he, the author of The Relaxation Response and other books after that, saying when you're going to give people information, it's a good idea to prepare them first with a few moments of breathing like we did together, I
Mm.
think right before we started the show, which was such a good idea. And that element can be brought in so many places in a session after people will sometimes have an important realization or an experience that would be called an abreaction. I'll sometimes say, well, let's just breathe into that and allow yourself to absorb what's been important about that experience, because your inner mind knows something about how you can incorporate this. And I don't know exactly how. You will know how, and then give that person a chance to really allow integration to happen. That's a little bit hypnotic, it's a little bit intuitive, it's a little bit intentional. It's an amalgam of a lot of the pieces that you and I have been discussing. And, I'm continuing to explore too, and thinking of new ways to bring this information into other people's lives. And
Yeah. Well, that's a great place for us to wind up. And I want to thank you for bringing it into our lives here. And so, Bette Freedson, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Rap Radio.
pleasure's mine, David. Thank you so much.